everybody for coming back for this discussion of the state of open science at Stanford. Let me introduce our panelists first, and then the format's going to be each of the panelists is going to talk for about 5 minutes about sort of their relevant interests, thoughts, opinions about sort of what's going on at Stanford right now that's relevant to the goals of CORES and to open science and reproducibility generally, and then we'll have some kind of panel discussion growing out of the points that are raised. As we go along, if you have questions that come up, please type them in the Q&A, and we'll try to address those in the question session. So our panelists today are Melissa Bondy, who is chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health and co-director of the Stanford Center for Population Health Sciences. Emmanuel Candes is the Barnum-Simons chair in mathematics and statistics and director of the Stanford Data Science Institute. Steve Goodman is the associate dean of clinical and translational research, professor of epidemiology and population health and medicine, and he's co-founder and co-director of Metrics, which has spearheaded reproducibility efforts at Stanford over a number of years now. John Krosnick is the Frederick O. Glover Professor in Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of Communication and Political Science, and leader of the CASBIS group on best practice in science. And then to be joining us shortly is Cam Moeller, who is Vice Provost and Dean of Research and Professor of Physics and Applied Physics. So why don't we start with Steve?
Okay. Well, thanks, and thanks for having me, and great symposium. I think I'll talk about some efforts we're doing in the School of Medicine exactly along these lines of an intersecting effort with shared values. And that's a new program coming out of the Senior Associate Dean for Research's office called the Stanford Program on Rigor and Reproducibility. And we're using the terms rigor and reproducibility because those are the words du jour of the NIH. And there really has been a sea change in terms of the receptivity to training and support in exactly some of the things you've talked about today, because of a requirement that all training grants include a strong rigor and reproducibility component. The rigor is a little to the left of what we've talked about today, and that's really just the strength of design and analysis of experiments, which is obviously the cornerstone. And the reproducibility part is that the is more closely related. Obviously, we share that word in the titles of the centers, and it's about making the data in a way that's accessible both to the investigator and potentially to people outside. And I think a lot of what we're doing to start and reflecting on the state of open science at Stanford is data gathering. So we're planning, again, in the School of Medicine, a data management survey to get a sense of how people are, what the platforms are. And I would say that this is very, very different on the clinical side versus the lab side. So we're having two different kinds of surveys going on there. We also have, we're doing a multi-institutional survey to look at all the other, what are called CTSA, Clinical Translational Service Award institutions, which is most major research universities, the medical research universities in the U.S., and looking at the sort of programs they have to support rigor and reproducibility, some of which might intersect or parallel with the kinds of things that we just heard are going on at Harvard. And the third thing is actually a foundation-funded project through the Center for Population Health Sciences on looking at open sharing practices by Stanford faculty in the social sciences. So that has just started, and I think that will be of great interest to you. And the reason it's in the social sciences and not we're doing some medicine is that was the interest of the supporting foundation. Other things we're doing, which I think it was alluded to by the question by Michelle Mello, is this is not just we view this not as a technical enterprise. On the technical side, we're developing courses. We have one on the books already. that should facilitate the kind of tools used to support data sharing and reproducibility, again, just like we've just heard. But we think what's really, really important is culture change. And culture change occurs from the bottom to the top. So one of the things we're trying to do, that we're going to have subgroups working on, is first of all drafting modified promotion criteria, that is materials that promotion committees can use, and also ways to show on CVs what open science efforts one has made and what are the fruits of those efforts. In a sense, like an enhanced teaching CV. If you don't show this type of stuff, you can't value it. And I think committees do want to value it. So we have a number of activities related to culture change. We're also developing a cadre of, and this is supported by one of the dean's offices, of graduate students who will be ambassadors to go into labs, who will know the requisite tools and techniques and also can be our antenna and who can promote open science practices or reproducible research practices in the lab. That is, in the lab meetings, in the project planning sessions, in the places where no central group can necessarily reach. And this is part of changing the culture from the bottom while we're also working at the top. And we'll also work with developing the same sort of centralized resources that we just heard Harvard is doing, and hopefully with partnering with CORES to support the computational and statistical side, which we want to make this easy for people. We want to make it something that they want to do because it helps them, and we want to make it easy for them, and we want to make it rewarded. And that's what we're trying to do in the School of Medicine. We're focusing mainly there because it's such an intensive effort to try to change the practices that have gone back so long and that are reinforced by journals, by the practices of the people around them. We don't feel that we can train people or educate people, young scientists, in the tools with good conscience and release them into research environments where the tools are then not used. That's not right. So we have to operate at all levels. So just to summarize, we have a series of information gathering efforts which to sort of assess this question, and are developing a variety of support tools and incentive tools that hopefully will support this for the long term. And I really look forward to the partnership between the two centers because the emphasis on data science and computational support, which is, I think, one of the hallmarks of CORES, in addition to many other things, is going to be a really valuable asset that we are going to need to tap into. So I'll just stop talking there.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. No, that was great. So let's turn now to Cam Moeller, who is our Vice Provost and Dean of Research.
Great. Thanks, Russ. Thanks for the invitation, and super sorry for being here a few minutes late. Particularly, I would have liked to hear Steve's entire remarks. So fortunately, I see that it's being recorded. So it's great that, Steve, you talked right before me, because I do want to say something about metrics just briefly too as we go through. In general, I want to talk about the values of the Center for Open and Reproducible Science. The mission of the center is to develop and nurture transparency and reproducibility and the collection, analysis, and dissemination of data across all domains of scientific activity. Just reading that from the website. And I think that's an amazing and important mission. And when I signed up 2 years ago to become Dean of Research, I imagined that by now, by 2021, I'd be giving talks about how we're rolling out our new online lab notebook system where every student and PI can check the box of share all my results immediately around the world, rather than what I've been doing, which is dealing with foreign interference issues, figuring out how to make Stanford research robust against them and still keep us as open as possible, dealing with a budget crisis and dealing with a pandemic. So I'm just super excited to have the opportunity to be here and talk about something that's as inspirational as the topic that this panel is about. The Center for Open and Reproducible Science has 4 values: transparency and openness, reproducibility, diversity and inclusion, and community-mindedness. And I'd like to talk about each of these values a little bit and illustrate how they have already taken hold at Stanford, but more importantly, share my thoughts about what they mean in a broader context. And I'll spend half my time on the first one, transparency and openness, because I think the others kind of all flow from that. So if you look at the state of open science, transparency and openness at Stanford, I first of all want to give a big shout out to Metrics, the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford, which, and I quote here, aims to understand the causes of reporting biases in research and in communications with policymakers and the public, and just say how incredibly important I think that activity is. I also have a lot of excitement and faith in the initiative called APARD, Accelerating Public Access to Research Data, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's led by the Association of American Universities and the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. And that initiative is developing and implementing policies, practices, and guidance. And if you like, we can all chat about the difference between a policy, a practice, and guidance. But things that we all need to do to ensure public access to federally funded data. And I think it'll be just really quite wonderful to have a better set of shared standards for that, right? Just like the protection of human subjects research, of humans in human subjects research has been really accelerated by the set of regulations that lead to the institutional review boards that review that research. And then one more thing I want to point out is the Office of Technology Licensing and the work that the Office of Technology Licensing has been doing to make sure that our licenses are used for the public good. So in the case of COVID-19 patenting and licensing strategies, we have given royalty-free licenses, asking the licensees for a commitment to distribute the resulting products as widely as possible and at a low cost that allows broad accessibility. So I know that's not quite what this panel is about, but I think it's very much in the same spirit. So I just want to say why transparency and openness is so important. And I suspect that if you're on this panel or here to listen to this panel, you already know why transparency and openness are so important. But one of the things that happens when we talk with the federal government, as well as with companies about the appropriate level of transparency and openness for Stanford research, some folks feel like they kind of want to keep everything, keep the barn door locked so all the good stuff can stay inside the barn, right? But a lot of people, and this includes the United States Department of Defense, the top officials in the Department of Defense who are funding research have a very keen understanding of the value that comes from open research. So if you talk to, for example, Bindu Nair, she will be the first to tell you that if you already kind of know what you're doing, closed research can be a great way to make progress and keep that progress from other people. But when you're looking for truly transformational applications in progress benefit from the value of an open research environment where you can bring the creativity and fast progress that only a worldwide approach can bring. So that's the first benefit of transparency and openness. The second benefit of transparency and openness is that it's how we earn the trust of the public. The public funds our research. Even if we're doing some research that's funded by a company or funded by a private gift, we're still heavily subsidized by the public. The public's elected representatives determine public policies. We advocate for evidence-based public policies to create a stronger, more resilient, and more just society. So we, as scientists, are very interdependent with the public. But according to a survey by the Pew Research Center in 2019, 63% of the American public believes that the scientific method generally produces accurate conclusions, but 35% of our citizens say that the scientific method can produce, quote, any result a researcher wants. And about 1/3 of Americans apparently don't understand that science is a collaborative search for truth based on empirical evidence. 60% of Americans say that scientists should take an active role in policy debates. 39% say that scientists should focus on establishing sound scientific facts and stay out of policy debates. A fact that particularly concerns me, as I think that sound scientific facts very much belong in policy debates across a number of important topics. Only 35% of the American public believes that environmental researchers provide fair and accurate information, and only 16% believe that environmental researchers admit and take responsibility for their mistakes. So these are sobering results. But this same survey pointed to a lever that can help us to increase public trust in science. It said that most Americans say they trust scientific research findings more when the data are openly available to the public. So the point is that transparency and openness not only lead to better science, they also increase public trust in science. And so it's a really important responsibility for us. Okay, I plan to say some things about reproducibility and diversity inclusion and community mindedness, but I got too excited about openness and transparency, so I talked too long. So I'll wrap it up now, Russ, and turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kim. Let's turn to Emmanuel next.
Thank you, Russ. Thanks for inviting me. So we do open science, as you said, because we want replicability. That is, we want to have our findings stand the test of time. And I think it's the fact that they stand the test of time is what buys you a bit of public trust. I would say that replicability has two aspects. One, which is perhaps a narrow sense of replicability, it's basically the ability to, for anyone in the world, to reproduce the exact step of your data analysis on the same data set and find the same findings. And that's one aspect of replicability and reproducibility. But there's another aspect that we have not talked about yet, which is that we would like the results we publish to be replicable in the sense that they should be confirmed by future scientific studies and not vanish into thin air. We want things that are not ephemeral. We want to publish things that are not ephemeral. And so we want replicability of the findings, not only in your own study, but in future studies. And so we have really these two aspects of replicability. And I would argue, since Russ asked us to talk about replicability in the context of Stanford, that we are very strong in both. First of all, the first aspect, the first element, I've heard rumors, and people may contradict me if these rumors are wrong, that John Claerbout, who is a professor of earth science, forced his students in the 70s to actually write theses with code embedded in it. You would click on portions of the thesis, experiments would run, and you would replicate the results. So it basically had the intuition of notebooks 30, 40 years ahead of our time. Donahoe followed up, advertising very eloquently that a paper is merely an advertisement of the code behind the paper, and that we should take papers really as advertisement of scholarship and not scholarship itself, that the real scholarship is in the data, in the code that you publish. So we're very strong in the replicability in a sense that anyone should be able to reproduce your analysis. And because of your center, Russ will keep this strength, that's for sure. But there's also a second element. And as you know, I'm not sure what my audience is to know, but everybody knows that experiments do not come out black and white. And so how do we determine a finding? And that's really a statistical issue. And so how should we assess the strengths of the statistical evidence so that we can go ahead and publish the finding? And so to make sure that, you know, future studies will replicate our findings. And probably many of you are aware of the big replicability crisis in the sciences, where many published research does not seem to stand up to close scrutiny. And so we have enormous strengths in this as well. We have, and maybe this is my spiel, we have a Department of Statistics which has been enormously invested in developing statistical methods and tools to make sure that what we report, what we distill from bigger and bigger data sets can actually stand the test of time and be replicated. I want to mention the work of Brad Efron on false discovery rate theory. I want to mention the work of my colleagues, John Taylor and Rob Tipsharani on selective inference, which is when you run many models on the same data set and somehow you pick the best model, the one that seems to suggest the strongest evidence of an association, how do you account for the fact that you looked a bit everywhere before you publish your results? And Jonathan Taylor, and perhaps during the Q&A, I would like to say more about his work, has a framework called interactive analysis, where somehow it's really at the intersection of these two replicability issues, keeps track of the data analysis tries to actually calibrate the strengths of evidence appropriately. Myself and my colleagues, we have worked on the replicability problem and developed statistical techniques to address the replicability issue. And so I think that we have these two components, the John Claerbout component and the statistical component, and we're extremely strong in both. And I think your center, Russ, provides an enormous impediment to join forces and address both at once. Now, Steve talked about a cultural change, and I completely believe in it. To me, cultural change starts with education. And I hope that together we can design a course for undergrads, pointing and explaining the challenges of replicability, both in both aspects, both statistically and in the sense that you have it in mind. And I think we can do great things. So thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
So thanks very much. All right, John.
All right. You're going to give me the opportunity to share my screen, or do I just do that?
I think you should be able to.
I will try that. How is that?
Yeah, we're good.
There. All right, let's try this. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly and I'm going to introduce some new ideas to the discussion, I think. And I'll begin with the fact that our time together has been framed as a conference that using the phrase open science more so than reproducibility in the publicity for today, which is, as according to Wikipedia anyway, the making dissemination accessible of the products, as we have been talking about in lots of ways, including the keynote this morning. And yet, of course, there is reproducible is half the name of the center here. And so I'm going to focus a little bit more here, but I want to kind of stretch the definition, I hope, in a useful way for our discussion by introducing the CASBIS group on best practices in science, which Russ mentioned earlier. Lee Jessam, who's a professor of psychology at Rutgers, and I created this a few years ago when we were fellows at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford, and we continue it. And so we're stretching the definition in the sense that I think we could all agree on what it means to be open, to share resources. We can agree on what it means for work to be replicable, just as Emmanuel just discussed. But I would argue that replicable is not enough. That, in other words, we can analyze the same data and get the same result, and others can do similar studies and get the same result, but that doesn't mean that the result is right or valid or accurate. And in fact, I think we all agree what we really need is, in the end, replicability as a pathway to accuracy. And that if we don't have replicability, obviously we don't have validity, but there's more to it than that. At the CASBIS group, what we're doing is, if you look on the left-hand side here of our website, you can see that what we're essentially trying to do is to not let the lessons of the past be lost. We're trying to create an archive where, instead of just saying, oh, that paper was retracted, it's gone, or somebody wrote that thing 5 years ago, it's off there in the literature someplace. We're trying to gather and organize all of the insights in a way that's kind of retrievable, that's all there in all of its richness. And some of the topics that we're looking at, for example, we're gathering academic publications, news articles, describing instances of scientific misconduct, describing instances of science correcting itself, talking about statistical forensics that are being used along the lines Emmanuel was talking about and others to detect problems in the evidence, work on bias against the null hypothesis, There is a kind of related topic is the question of who should be authors of articles, which I think has implications for quality of work. And this is just an example of the academic publications page, and just to give you a little feel for the various topics that are addressed. So we've done our best to collect up publications on each of these topics, but I'm sure we're missing ones, and we're constantly trying to find more, and we would love to have your suggestions of what to add. And so I want to now ask this question, is openness in science desirable? Well, it is, of course, for efficiency purposes and all of the reasons that have been discussed so far, but I think I'm going to be maybe a little bit more blunt, that it forces me within my lab to do better housekeeping than I think I might have done otherwise, if my work will be open to others. And I'll admit to you, I'm involved in a 4-university, very expensive multi-site project now, trying to replicate the results of each other's labs. And Stanford became the data repository for this after a series of 5 years of data collection. The other 3 universities provided their data to us in order for us to write papers using data from all 4 schools. And I won't tell you how horrified we were with the fact that we didn't give every lab standards in advance for how to document their work. And these are high-level labs that are at the cutting edge of the reproducibility movement. You would think we would all have our act together in terms of documenting our work clearly. And we knew for sure that we were going to be scrutinized. And yet, in fact, what we have here is a mess to clean up. So maybe knowing that our work will be seen by others leads us to make fewer accidental mistakes because we're being more careful with our own work. And that's presumably driven by a fear of being caught or embarrassed. But there is also the possibility that our work might be scrutinized in a way that would lead us to implement better research practices, not just not making accidental mistakes, but not p-hacking. That if I know I do my work, I publish a paper, my data become publicly available, and somebody else could then open the data and say, did Krosnick reach appropriate conclusions? I don't want to be caught making an accidental mistake, but I also don't want to be caught intentionally p-hacking, again, driven by fear of getting caught. But the argument I would make to you is this: the probability of getting caught is actually tiny if the mountain of data accumulated through the open science movement is huge. And it will be. We've heard this today. There will be a huge mountain of data available. There's no doubt that having the mountain is a great idea. But the question is it really rational for people to be fearful and to therefore be motivated in the way we would hope? And so I'll just ask this question: how can we incentivize sifting through the mountain? And here I'm linking into what Steve was talking a bit about in terms of changing the culture. One example that I'll tell you about comes from the disaster of Dietrich Stoppel, who's a social psychologist at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. You undoubtedly have heard about the fact that he was profiled in the New York Times Magazine and elsewhere as having fabricated the data in a huge number of studies, that causing a huge number of retractions. And the entire country of the Netherlands and all of the scientific community there was horrified by this, which led to a really interesting innovation at Utrecht University, which is in the sociology department, and perhaps across the entire university. They have implemented an annual review of faculty by the department, where each faculty member is randomly assigned to review the data in a publication of another faculty member from the prior year. So there's a random selection. I get assigned to you randomly, and then I get assigned to one of your publications from last year. And my job is to go into the data and check and see if everything in your publication is accurate. This creates that incentive to check the accuracy of results. And that, I don't know yet how that's all been going for the last few years in terms of what it's turned up, but it certainly increases the probability that your work is going to get scrutinized and will be consequential significantly. I guess I would hope that another possible strategy is the BPS website that I just showed you earlier, the best practices in science, that by consolidating evidence of scientific successes and failures over time, that they're, that kind of saying, oh, well, somebody caught my mistake and my paper was retracted, but nobody remembers that. It's off in the history. Maybe that would be helpful to not forget. I want to just end with one last example when all of the above, I think, will fail. And I think this is a goal that perhaps Stanford ought to also consider pursuing. And that is when the entire research community has, I'm sorry to be a little blunt here, drunk the same Kool-Aid. And the sad example I'll tell you about is survey research. I don't know how many of us, I mean, I know you're all aware of what I'm about to show you. I'm not sure you connect the dots. So these are headlines in major publications. How did Israel's pollsters miss Netanyahu's re-election? British elections, other losers, pollsters. Why political polls are so often wrong. Why are the polls getting it wrong in so many countries? One possible answer to this question is that there has been an abandonment, a wholesale abandonment of good methodology in a way that kind of everybody's drinking the Kool-Aid. And so the answer here that I'll propose to you is that the internet made it quick and easy for survey data to be collected. And it could be done with truly random samples of populations, but that's not actually very profitable. And in fact, after setting up infrastructure, data collection from non-random samples, such as Mechanical Turk and online panels, is highly profitable, quick and easy. So survey research has gone running in the direction of companies that are literally making billions of dollars a year, having set up the infrastructure where the system runs itself. And I just want to show you very quickly a couple of examples there that for those of you who know statistics, it won't surprise you, I assume that's everybody, that random sampling works better than non-random sampling. So this is the distribution of errors of 1 percentage point, 2 percentage points, 3 percentage points, and so on across the x-axis in a study that David Yeager did. And the taller the bar, the more errors there are at that level. And what you can see is from a series of truly random samples, the distribution of errors is close to 0. But this is the distribution of errors from non-random samples. So I'll just go back and forth, random samples, non-random samples, random samples, non-random samples. This isn't surprising. When it comes to pre-election surveys, these are from 2016. These are the frequencies of errors of 1 and 2 percentage points in predicting candidate shares of the vote from random samples. And this is the distribution of errors from non-random samples. Random samples, not random samples. The biggest error is at 16 percentage points. If you want to predict the outcome of the US presidential election in 2020, you don't need to look at all of the states in the country. You just need to look at a small set of states where the margin of victory is very sharp. And I just want to show you that in 2016, these are the states where there were very close margins of victory for Donald Trump that gave him the White House. This is how many polls were done during the last week before the election in each of these states. This is how many of them involved random samples. So what you're looking at is a set of predictions that are made using data that don't use the optimal method. And the world has kind of agreed that this is fine. And yet we end up with the kind of embarrassment you saw. And by the way, this is the one instance in Florida, 1 out of 16, that was a random sample and had an average error of 1 percentage point. So my point here is just to say, sorry, let me not go there. My point here is just to say that to complement openness and to complement reproducibility, we also want validity. And there are not a lot of opportunities for assessing validity, but this is one of them. And this is a story of how perhaps at Stanford, we can also be leaders in helping the scientists around the world implement best practices. And that's what leads to our best practices name for the center. The last thing I'm going to do is put up this picture, which I don't want you to read. This is a causal diagram of what Lee Jessam and I call the social psychology of misbehavior by scientists. In other words, this is what we think may be the social and psychological processes that cause people to behave badly, to cause people to produce irreproducible and invalid results. And it's interesting that we haven't seen this kind of analysis come out of the open science movement particularly, because I would argue that everything we've been talking about today, creating archives, making data available, seeking reproducibility, all of that stuff is caused by people. And we can think intuitively, oh, well, making the data available, that'll reduce the problem. Having more people replicate at Utrecht University, that'll reduce the problem. But wouldn't we as social psychologists want to understand what it is that causes the bad behavior in the first place? And understanding incentives and how it is that interventions can potentially operate will maybe lead us to realize that there are so many experiences in public health and so many other fields where well-meaning and very wise interventions didn't work. And so is it possible that so much of what we're doing now to improve scientific practice in the end will definitely improve efficiency? There's no doubt about that. But do we want it also to improve the accuracy of our findings? And do we want to think about, are these interventions really going to change behavior in ways that are consequential? So I just wanted to add that to the discussion. Thank you, Russ, for letting me do that.
Perfect. Thanks, John. All right, let's turn to Melissa Bondi to finish out our commentaries, and then we'll have a few minutes for discussion. We can't hear you.
You're muted.
Doesn't that happen on every Zoom call? And I'm really sorry about that. But first of all, Russ, I want to thank you for including me, and also to hear, I'm fairly new to Stanford, so it's really impressive to hear all of the things that are going on and the importance of the education and the work that both this center is doing as well as what Steve's doing in the medical school, because we can see that there's so much room for error, and hopefully it's unintentional, but as an epidemiologist, we think about big data, and it's so important for us to be able to have large data sets and work as team scientists. And I think that this whole idea of rigor and reproducibility is, you know, something that we have to address, all of us, on every grant that we submit, and having guidelines and ways for people to understand, and especially starting with junior, with people in undergraduate program all the way through those that are in training, and trying to understand what it all means. And I think there's a lot of people that are concerned because they feel like they have to make it, and the pressure of being able to do this. And I think that these were some of the things, John, that you were alluding to, and the concerns about how people, you know, have to produce and to make it. But the things that we've been dealing with is, I've worked in team science. We've had large studies that have been international studies, and the importance of being able to use common questionnaires and, you know, being able to have standard practices in our research has been, you know, for things that I've done over the years, and what are really important to have standard practices, standard questionnaires, ways to document things, ways to be able to pull things from medical records and other sources that are important to document the work that we do. But also, as I do a lot of work in genetics, and anytime NIH pays for anything that has genetic material, we have to post it. And everything is put onto dbGaP, which means that, you know, we might have smaller data sets that we're putting up that might have, you know, large genetic data. But as people start pooling data, they have to understand where the data are coming from, who the people are that the genetic data are derived from. But we've had to deal with this in our work for many years, but I'm not sure how all of the junior people are being trained to do this. And I think it's really important for us as researchers, as having centers, to be able to think about how do we train the next generation, and the work that you're doing is so important. But the reasons why NIH has been putting all of these checks and balances into our work is that we have to think about how do we share, and how are we honest brokers of data as well. And that's another issue that we could talk about, is who are the honest brokers, and how are these data shared with others, especially if there's HIPAA issues and regulations, and making sure that we are not violating any of these kinds of things that with HIPAA, and especially with genetic data, is that you can really, across data sets, maybe figure out who people are. But I think that, you know, with so much data, that people are either so concerned about how their data are shared, but also some people are just think that maybe it's not as relevant because anybody can get access to anything. But I think all of us need to understand the checks and balances around those kinds of things, and making sure that we discuss this, and especially, Steve, the things you're doing in medicine. There's so many areas of HIPAA violation, and how do we reproduce the data that we have, and know that you don't have the same people in the data, that you're able to sort out all of those things. And especially in genetic information, is if people participate in multiple studies, you could have people in the same data sets more than once. And, lots of cleaning of data, making sure, especially with gender and genetic data, you can pull out that, when you're looking at chromosomes, that whether or not you have, someone categorizes them a female, but you realize these are really males. But, just cleaning and, making sure that the data that are presented and posted online are reproducible, and that others can use the data and come up with the same results that somebody else did or expand on that. And that's actually the beauty of having so much data, is people being able to explore and trying to come up with new hypotheses and having a lot of data available. And I'm also the co-director of the Center for Population Health Science, where we, our premise is that we have data available for people to use and to be able to understand and to use it for different purposes. And, I think that there's limitations to every data set that we have. And I think understanding each of those things is important for us as we move forward with research. But obviously training the next generation is critical, and for us to set the standards, and also to be the ones to try to teach and to have people understand the limitations of our work, and to do a better job in training the next generation. I'm looking forward to the open panel, and there's so many things that we've discussed and so many areas that we could go on for many hours of discussion for these things. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So we have about 10 minutes for discussion. I want to actually, I think that one of the really central issues here is around incentives. Like, how do we get people to feel incentivized to actually do this stuff? And so there's a really interesting question that Benoit Monin raised in the Q&A. I'll just read it quickly. I agree 100% with Steve Goodman's suggestion to eventually take into account open science and promotion review. But in the spirit of transparency and openness, how do we deal with it as an institution with the fact that junior faculty going through review now and in the next few years may not have been given this playbook when they were hired or even at midterm review? Should we perhaps be mindful of the need for a transition period as junior faculty who've been given this clear message, assuming they are now, come through the pipeline? I'm concerned that in the short term, we could be changing the rules of the game mid-game for some junior faculty without the junior faculty in question even knowing it, since review discussions do not include them. I appreciate that important changes are really costless, but I get worried when the main cost is to be paid by the people with the least power and who may literally not be in the room. I'm interested to hear thoughts of the panel about that question.
I can answer just a few sentences. I think actually this is only a value add. That is, I don't think anybody who's been practicing this, that anything that we do will take away from what they've been doing. And the very first step, even before any promotion criteria can be written or adopted, is developing a format for CVs that shows it. My experience at Stanford is that promotion committees want to reward things. They want to reward things that are valuable. The problem is traditional CVs don't show them, which is why we had to develop a whole format for a teaching portfolio to really show what you were doing. So I think the very first thing we could and should do, which could be implemented very fast, is a format for a CV that would highlight these activities and show them. And for the moment, we might not have formal written promotion criteria, but the promotion committees will, I do think, value these things if they're shown the right way. So I think we can do that actually quite quickly, and it might actually reward people for stuff that they've been doing that might not get rewarded otherwise. I don't think it's in any way changing the rules that will hamper anybody. I think it will only reward. I think that's completely doable, and very excited about getting that done in the next, I would say, 4 to 6 months.
That's great. Others have thoughts on this?
I agree with what Steve said, and I want to add in what Quay, if I pronounced that correctly, said about not just the worries about junior faculty, but also pushing more senior tenured faculty into open science principles. I think that is a great question, and Steve's suggestion about the CV formats, some of the same ideas of how you could include this in tenure review could also be used in other kinds of review, like at salary setting time for the chairs and and deans to review at salary setting time. That said, I think we all know that, salary growth, especially in low inflation eras, is not a huge motivator for most of us as faculty. And so I think the kind of discussion and work that you are doing, Russ, with the center and other people on this panel is really incredibly important, because I do think it's really about community values.
I just want to add another thing about team science. And I think for the leaders of big team science projects that are bringing in junior people because they have access to data, is that they really need to walk the walk. And I've always had, in any of the big projects I've been involved in, especially in writing papers, is to have the junior person as the first author. And making sure that they have a role in this process, because they learn from the senior people, and it's up to the more senior investigators to show the junior people that they have an important role and that they should be a lead author on some of these publications, to show that, especially when it comes time for review and tenure, is that they've had this role. And it's important that we as senior people walk the walk and show people, especially junior people, that they have an important role. And also it's a way to get them involved in some of these big projects where they will have some role in this and have credit for it.
I just want to add that part of what I was talking about is already done in some of the rule guidelines about how to recognize contributors to team science. So this has already been, some of the ground here has already been plowed.
And just so we don't lose Benoit's...
Sorry, John.
Oh, sorry, it's very quick. So we don't lose Benoit's important point, that for junior faculty who have been operating without a set of expectations or rewards, like Steve's talking about, obviously it's easy to sort of tell them explicitly, if you can do it, great. If you haven't done it, it's not going to be held against you. And it may be that, Steve, what I'm hearing you say is that it won't be held against other people, but it will be a bonus if the more they do it.
It's another way to achieve.
You got to manage it carefully, the communication and the implementation, but that is doable.
Yeah, I wrote a piece, sort of an opinion piece a couple of years ago, titled "The Cost of Reproducibility," which was about, these issues that early career people often raise with me, which is, doing reproducible, robust research is going to lead to you having fewer papers in fancy journals. It's going to, reduce, you're going to do more studies that don't work, right? And so it puts them, even if those things are, sort of nominally on the, even if open science, transparency, reproducibility stuff is, is being rewarded, it's still the case that all the other things that are, numbers of publications, the impact factor, whatever, those things are still at the top of the list of the things that are being judged for, hiring, promotion, tenure, whatever. And so there's still a concern that people who do the harder work are going to necessarily be disadvantaged. And the question is how you balance that out, I think.
How about this? The more open science you do, the less publications you have to have in order to get tenure.
I just want to ask, is that really true for Stanford? Because in the School of Medicine, we're told it is not your number of publications. We're told to take those out of the long forms and focus only on one or two of the best. I don't know how universal that is, whether that's the whole Stanford model, but that message is being sent pretty strongly. And that would that would reward this. I don't know. Question for
Cam may have something to say about that.
I don't know if we have anyone who's been on the ad board, but I do think that there's room both for university-wide standards and for local variations in how those standards are applied. And that's totally appropriate in university promotion. In my experience, it's really the whole portfolio. It's the whole distribution. It's certainly not counting publications. And in most cases, it's not just your most important one or two publications either. Although sometimes someone will write 2 publications that are enough, but more often it's like, yeah, you've written some fantastic publications, you've written some really good publications, and the whole portfolio is what matters. That said, we do, there are some units in which you write a description of the person's 3 or 5 most important publications, but it's not that the committee only considers those. The committee just looks at those in greater depth.
Awesome. Okay, so we unfortunately we have to end this discussion, but I really appreciate all of your contributions, and I will clap for you, even though since nobody else can clap. So thanks very much. And so give us just a moment. We're gonna flip over and get ready for Fernando Perez's talk. So we'll be back in just a second.